Welcome to my channel. Today's story brings us to 1861 and to a woman named Hagar Ashford. She was a towering black woman, far too intelligent to ever submit. They tried to break her will. They tried to silence her mind. Instead, they ended up selling her 12 times. This story is not an easy one. Pause for a moment. Listen carefully. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments the city and country you're listening from. Your voice helps keep these lives remembered, not erased. Let's begin. In the winter of 1861, a woman stood in the freezing December wind on a Virginia auction block for the 12th time in her life. She stood nearly 6'4", tall. Her shoulders were broad, like a man's. Her hands were massive, calloused, and strong enough to snap a grown man's neck. But it wasn't her size that made buyers hesitate. It wasn't her strength that made plantation owners whisper warnings to each other across the crowded square. It was her eyes. Those eyes held something no enslaved person was ever supposed to possess. They held calculation. They held patience. They held the cold, burning certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and exactly what was coming next. That morning's auctioneer was a man named Samuel Cretan. He had been selling human beings for 23 years. He had seen thousands of men, women, and children pass through his hands. He had watched families torn apart. He had listened to mothers scream as their babies were ripped from their arms. None of it had ever troubled him. To Samuel Cretan, enslaved people were just livestock, nothing more. But this woman troubled him. She had arrived at his auction house 3 days earlier, brought by a trader from Albemarle County, who seemed almost relieved to be rid of her. When Samuel asked why she was being sold, the trader just shook his head and said 4 words that would haunt Samuel for the rest of his life. "She destroys everything she touches." Samuel had laughed at the time. He had seen strong-willed enslaved people before. He had seen fighters, runners, rebels. He knew how to break them all. A few days in the cellar without food or water, a few sessions with the whip, a few examples made of others. Everyone broke eventually. But 3 days later, standing on that auction block, Samuel understood what the trader had meant. This woman had not tried to run. She had not fought. She had not said a single word. She had simply stood there day after day, watching everything with those terrible eyes. And in those 3 days, Samuel's best horse had broken its leg in the stable. His wife had discovered his mistress and left him. And his business partner had been arrested for forgery. Coincidence? That's what Samuel told himself. Just coincidence. But when he looked into those eyes on that auction block, he wasn't so sure anymore. Her name was Hagar. She was 41 years old, and she was about to complete a plan that had taken her 12 years to execute. This is her story. Hagar Ashford was born in the spring of 1820 on a tobacco plantation called Sweetwater, located about 15 miles outside of Richmond, Virginia. Her mother was a house slave named Ruth, who worked in the main house as a seamstress. Her father was unknown, though the lighter shade of Hagar's skin suggested what everyone already knew but never spoke about. Ruth was an extraordinary woman. She had been born in Africa, captured at the age of 12, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean in the belly of a slave ship. She had survived the Middle Passage. She had survived the auction blocks of Charleston. She had survived 30 years of bondage. And through all of it, she had held on to something that should have been beaten out of her long ago. She had held on to her mind. Ruth could read. Not just simple words, but complex texts in English and French. She had learned in secret over many years, stealing moments whenever she could, a newspaper left on a table, a letter discarded in the trash, pages from books used to start fires in the kitchen. Ruth collected words the way other slaves collected moments of rest. Each one was precious. Each one was power. And Ruth understood something that most people in her position never learned. She understood that the true chains of slavery were not made of iron. They were made of ignorance. The masters kept their slaves illiterate not because reading was useless, but because reading was the most dangerous weapon a slave could possess. A slave who could read could forge passes. A slave who could read could understand the law. A slave who could read could communicate across distances. A slave who could read could plan. Ruth began teaching Hagar to read when the girl was just 4 years old. They practiced in the small hours of the night by candlelight, in the cramped quarters they shared with 6 other slaves. Ruth used a stick to scratch letters into the dirt floor. She made Hagar trace them over and over until the shapes became sounds, the sounds became words, and the words became meaning. It was the most dangerous thing a slave mother could do. The penalty for teaching a slave to read in Virginia was severe. For the teacher, it meant 39 lashes and possible sale to the deep south. For the student, it meant the same or worse. And for anyone who helped, or knew and didn't report it, the punishment was just as harsh. But Ruth did it anyway. Because Ruth understood that knowledge was the only inheritance she could give her daughter. The masters could take everything else. They could take her body. They could take her labor. They could take her dignity, but they could not take what was inside her mind. By the age of 7, Hagar could read better than most white children in the county. By 10, she had devoured every book she could get her hands on. And by 12, she had discovered the library. The master of Sweetwater Plantation was a man named Charles Ashford. He was a wealthy tobacco planter with over 200 slaves and one of the finest private libraries in Virginia. That library contained over 3,000 volumes, including works of philosophy, history, law, mathematics, and science. Charles Ashford was proud of his library. He considered himself an educated man, a gentleman of culture and refinement. He had no idea that his most valuable possession was being systematically consumed by a 12-year-old slave girl. She was chosen for this task because of her size and strength, which allowed her to move the heavy furniture and reach the high shelves. What no one realized was that Hagar had turned this chore into an education that would rival any university. She developed a system. Each morning, she would select one book from the shelves, memorize its exact location, and hide it in her clothing. During the day, between her other duties, she would find moments to read, a few pages at a time, in hidden corners of the plantation. At night, she would read by moonlight or by the glow of embers from the dying fire. And each morning before dawn, she would return the book to its exact position on the shelf. She read Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England and learned how property rights worked. She read Thomas Paine's Common Sense and understood that all men were supposed to be created equal. She read histories of slave revolts in the Caribbean and studied why they had succeeded or failed. She read books on agriculture, medicine, geography, and military strategy. She read anything and everything, consuming knowledge with a hunger that could never be satisfied. And she remembered everything. Hagar had been born with what people today would call a photographic memory. She could look at a page once and recall it perfectly years later. She could hear a conversation and repeat it word for word decades after it happened. Her mind was like a vast library of its own, and every book she read, every word she heard, every face she saw was filed away in perfect order, ready to be retrieved whenever she needed it. This gift would one day save her life. But first, it would destroy everything she loved. On a humid August morning in 1832, Charles Ashford walked into his library and found Hagar standing by the window reading a leather-bound copy of Cicero's orations in the original Latin. She had gotten careless. After years of perfect caution, she had allowed herself to become absorbed in a passage about justice and revenge, and she had not heard the master's footsteps in the hallway. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Hagar stood there with the book in her hands, watching Charles Ashford's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally cold fury. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but there was a tremor in it that Hagar had never heard before. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had been caught, and they both knew what that meant. Charles Ashford was not a cruel man by the standards of his time. He rarely whipped his slaves. He did not break up families casually. He provided adequate food, clothing, and medical care. He considered himself a Christian and a gentleman, and he believed sincerely that slavery was a positive good for the African race, lifting them from savagery into civilization. But what he was looking at now terrified him in a way he could not quite articulate. This was not just a slave who had learned to read. This was a slave who could read Latin. This was a slave who was standing in his library, surrounded by his books, absorbing his knowledge, thinking thoughts that no slave was ever supposed to think. This was a threat to everything he believed about the natural order of the world. "Who taught you?" he demanded. Hagar remained silent. She knew that her answer would determine not just her fate, but her mother's fate as well. If she confessed that Ruth had taught her, Ruth would be sold to the deep south, to the cotton fields and sugar plantations, where slaves were worked to death in a few years. If she lied and said she had taught herself, she might be able to protect her mother. But Charles Ashford was not a stupid man. He had already figured it out. That night, Ruth was dragged from her bed and brought to the whipping post in the center of the slave quarters. Every slave on the plantation was forced to watch as the overseer delivered 39 lashes to her bare back. The whip was made of cowhide, weighted with metal at the tips. Each stroke tore the flesh open. By the 15th lash, Ruth had stopped screaming. By the 30th, she had lost consciousness. But the punishment was not over. The next morning, still bleeding from her wounds, Ruth was loaded onto a wagon and taken to the slave market in Richmond. Charles Ashford had decided that having a literate slave on his plantation was too dangerous, even after punishment. Ruth had to go. Hagar begged to be allowed to say goodbye. She was denied. She begged to be sold with her mother. She was denied. She begged to know where her mother was being sent. She was denied. The last image Hagar ever had of her mother was the back of that wagon disappearing down the dusty road, carrying Ruth away to a fate that Hagar could only imagine. She never saw her mother again. She never learned where Ruth was sold or what happened to her. For all Hagar knew, her mother could have died on a cotton plantation in Mississippi, a sugar plantation in Louisiana, or a rice plantation in South Carolina. The South had swallowed her whole, and there was no way to find her. Hagar was 12 years old, and something inside her died that day. Something soft and hopeful and human. It was replaced by something else. Something cold and hard and patient. Something that would wait as long as it needed to wait, and do whatever it needed to do until justice was served. She made a vow that morning, standing in the dust where the wagon had been, staring at the empty road. She would make them pay. Not just Charles Ashford, though he would certainly pay, all of them. Every plantation owner, every slave trader, every overseer, every white person who had ever participated in this monstrous system. She would find a way to make them all pay. She was 12 years old, and she had just declared war. For the next 5 years, Hagar bided her time. She was more careful now, never letting anyone see her read, never revealing the vast library of knowledge locked inside her mind. To the overseers and the other slaves, she was just another field hand, strong, quiet, and obedient. But inside her head, she was planning. She studied the plantation's operations with the same intensity she had once applied to Cicero and Blackstone. She learned how tobacco was grown, harvested, and sold. She learned the names of the buyers and the prices they paid. She learned the routes the wagons took to market and the schedules the overseers followed. She learned the rhythms of the plantation so thoroughly that she could predict what would happen on any given day months in advance. And she learned the weaknesses. Every system has weaknesses. Every organization has vulnerabilities. Charles Ashford ran his plantation like a military operation, with strict schedules and clear chains of command. But that very rigidity created predictability, and predictability created opportunity. The overseer, a man named Jeremiah Tate, was a drunkard who spent every Saturday night in town and did not return until Sunday afternoon. During those hours, the plantation was effectively unsupervised. The bookkeeper, an elderly white man named Franklin Wells, was nearly blind and relied on his slaves to read documents aloud to him. He never suspected that Hagar sometimes changed words or numbers as she read. The slave quarters were inspected every week, but always on Wednesday mornings, giving anyone who wanted to hide something plenty of time to prepare. And the library, despite what had happened with Ruth, remained accessible. Charles Ashford had not changed the locks or restricted access. He believed that the brutal lesson of Ruth's punishment had taught all his slaves to stay away from books forever. He was wrong. In 1837, when Hagar was 17 years old, Charles Ashford made a decision that would seal his fate. He decided to expand his operations by purchasing a neighboring plantation called Willow Creek. The acquisition required a significant loan from a Richmond bank, and the loan documents were kept in a locked drawer in Charles Ashford's study. Hagar had been watching that drawer for months. She knew which key opened it, where that key was kept, and what hours of the day the study was empty. And one night in October, while the household slept, she made her move. She did not take anything from the drawer. That would have been noticed immediately. Instead, she read everything inside it, every document, every contract, every letter. Then she put everything back exactly as she had found it and returned to her quarters before dawn. What she learned changed everything. The loan documents contained a clause that Hagar had never seen before, but which she immediately recognized as significant. If Charles Ashford failed to make 3 consecutive payments, the bank had the right to seize not just Willow Creek, but Sweetwater as well, including all assets and slaves. The entire Ashford fortune was leveraged against this one acquisition. It was a tremendous risk. If the tobacco crop failed, if prices dropped, if anything went wrong, Charles Ashford could lose everything. Hagar saw the opportunity immediately, but she also saw the problem. If the plantation failed, the slaves would be sold at auction, scattered across the Streuth, their families destroyed. Many of them might end up in far worse situations than they were in now. And Hagar would lose any chance of finding her mother or executing the larger plan that was slowly taking shape in her mind. She needed to be more strategic. She needed to think not just about destroying this one plantation, but about building something larger, a network, a system, a weapon that could strike at the heart of slavery itself. And for that, she needed to be sold. It sounds insane. What slave would ever want to be sold? The auction block was every slave's worst nightmare, the place where families were destroyed and hope died. But Hagar understood something that the masters never did. She understood that the greatest power comes from movement. An enslaved person who stayed on one plantation their entire life knew only that one plantation. They knew its fields, its rhythms, its people, but they knew nothing of the larger world. They could not see the connections between plantations, the networks of trade, the vulnerabilities of the system. But a slave who moved from place to place, who was sold from one master to another, could learn things that no stationary slave could ever learn. They could map the territory. They could build connections. They could find the weak points in the armor. Hagar decided to become that slave. The question was how. Slaves did not get to choose when or whether they were sold. That decision belonged to the master alone. Hagar needed to find a way to make Charles Ashford want to sell her, while making sure she was sold to someone specific in a place she chose. The answer came from an unlikely source, the overseer's wife. Martha Tate was a bitter, jealous woman who had long suspected that her husband was taking liberties with the female slaves on the plantation. She was right, of course. Jeremiah Tate was a predator who used his position of power to assault women who had no ability to refuse. But Martha had never been able to prove it, and confronting her husband directly would only lead to violence against herself. Hagar saw an opportunity. She began leaving evidence where Martha would find it, a torn piece of fabric from a slave woman's dress hidden in Jeremiah's coat pocket, scratches on his back that could only have come from fingernails, whispered rumors that reached Martha through the house slaves who served her. Martha's jealousy grew into rage, and her rage grew into action. She began making her husband's life miserable, accusing him of infidelity, threatening to leave him, demanding that he get rid of the slave women she suspected. And because Jeremiah Tate was a weak man who could not stand up to his wife, he began looking for scapegoats. Hagar made sure she was one of them. She started being clumsy in her work, breaking tools, spilling water, making small mistakes that drew the overseer's attention. She made sure to be nearby whenever Martha was watching, cultivating a look that could be interpreted as defiance or desire, depending on who was looking. And she began muttering to herself in Latin, when she thought no one was listening, just loud enough to be overheard by people who would report it. Within 3 months, Jeremiah Tate had convinced Charles Ashford that Hagar was too dangerous to keep. Not because of her size or her strength, but because of her mind. The reports of her speaking in strange languages, the rumors of her unnatural abilities, the way she seemed to know things she shouldn't know. All of it combined to create a portrait of a slave who was more trouble than she was worth. In the spring of 1838, Hagar Ashford was sold for the first time. She was purchased by a man named Thomas Redford, who owned a medium-sized tobacco plantation about 40 miles from Sweetwater. Hagar had researched him thoroughly before maneuvering herself into being sold. She knew that his plantation bordered 3 others, that he had connections to traders who moved slaves between Virginia and Kentucky, and that he had a gambling problem that was slowly eating away at his fortune. She also knew that his library, while smaller than Charles Ashford's, contained something that Sweetwater's had not, a complete set of Virginia legal codes. Hagar had a plan. She was going to learn the law so thoroughly that she could use it as a weapon. She was going to find every loophole, every ambiguity, every vulnerability in the legal system that held her and millions of others in bondage. And then she was going to exploit them all. But first, she had to survive. Thomas Redford was not like Charles Ashford. He was not a gentleman who prided himself on treating his slaves humanly. He was a desperate man, drowning in debt, who saw his slaves as assets to be squeezed for every drop of value. He worked them from dawn until long after dark, He provided minimal food and clothing. He used the whip liberally for any infraction, real or imagined. And he had a particular interest in Hagar. Not a sexual interest, thankfully. Thomas Redford preferred younger, smaller women, but he had heard rumors about Hagar, about her strange abilities and her supposedly evil nature, and he was intrigued. He bought her specifically because he wanted to break her, to prove that there was nothing special about her, that she was just another piece of property to be used and discarded. He had no idea what he was dealing with. Hagar spent her first month on the Redford plantation learning the rhythms and routines, just as she had at Sweetwater. She worked hard, kept her head down, and gave no sign of the fire burning inside her. She let Thomas Redford believe that she was just another slave broken by the journey and terrified of her new master. But at night, while the other slaves slept, she was reading. Thomas Redford's library was in his study, which was locked at night. But locks meant nothing to Hagar. She had taught herself to pick them years ago, using techniques she had read about in a book on metallurgy and mechanical engineering. She could open any lock on the plantation in under a minute, and she made sure to practice until she could do it without making a sound. Every night, for hours, she sat in that dark study and read by moonlight, filling her mind with the laws of Virginia. She learned about property rights and contract law, about deeds and transfers, about the legal definitions of slavery, and the rare circumstances under which a slave could be freed. She learned about the courts and how they operated, about the judges and their precedents, about the endless bureaucracy that kept the system running, and she began to see the cracks. The legal system that supported slavery was vast and complex, but it was also old and inconsistent. Laws passed in one decade contradicted laws passed in another. Definitions varied from county to county. Enforcement was sporadic and often corrupt, and most importantly, the system relied on the assumption that slaves were illiterate and ignorant, that they could never understand the laws that bound them, let alone find ways to exploit them. Hagar was going to prove that assumption catastrophically wrong, but she was not going to do it alone. She needed allies. She needed a network, and to build that network, she needed to be sold again. This time, she did not need to be subtle. Thomas Redford was already suspicious of her, already looking for an excuse to get rid of her. All she needed to do was give him one. She chose fire. Not a large fire, not a dangerous fire, just a small blaze in the tobacco drying barn. Started with a candle and some dry leaves, easily extinguished before it could spread. But enough to cause damage, enough to cause fear, enough to make Thomas Redford believe that the rumors about Hagar were true, that she was dangerous and destructive, and needed to be gone. Within a week, she was sold again. This time, she was purchased by a slave trader named Marcus Webb, who planned to take her south to the cotton markets of Alabama. But Hagar had no intention of going to Alabama. She had done her research, and she knew that Marcus Webb had a secret. He was illiterate. Marcus Webb had built his entire business on bluster and intimidation. He could not read a single word, but he had learned to hide it so well that almost no one knew. He had partners who handled the paperwork, clerks who read documents aloud to him, and an elaborate system of symbols and marks that he used instead of written records. Hagar saw the opportunity immediately. On the second night of the journey south, while the other slaves were chained in the wagon and Marcus Webb was sleeping by the fire, Hagar made her move. She had already worked her way out of her chains, using a technique she had taught herself years ago. She approached Marcus Webb silently, a stolen knife in her hand, and pressed it against his throat before he could wake. "I know you can't read," she said quietly. And I know what that means for your business. If your partners find out, if your buyers find out, you'll be ruined. Everything you've built will be gone." Marcus Webb's eyes went wide with terror. No slave had ever spoken to him like this. No slave had ever held a knife to his throat. He was completely at her mercy. "I'm going to make you an offer," Hagar continued. "You're going to sell me to a man named William Garrett in Henrico County. You're going to tell him that I'm strong and obedient and perfect for field work. And you're going to forget you ever saw me. In exchange, I won't tell anyone your secret. I won't destroy your business. I won't cut your throat right now. Do we have a deal?" Marcus Webb nodded frantically. "Good," Hagar said. She removed the knife from his throat but kept it in her hand. "Now, put the chains back on me and let's get going. We have a long way to travel." William Garrett was not a random choice. He was the third name on a list that Hagar had been compiling for years. A list of the most powerful and most vulnerable slave owners in Virginia. Each name represented a step in her plan, a move in a game that only she could see. Charles Ashford was the first name. The man who had destroyed her family, the man whose plantation she had studied so thoroughly that she knew it better than he did. Thomas Redford was the second name, a gambler and a drunk, easy to manipulate, useful for gathering information about the slave trade routes. And William Garrett was the third name, because William Garrett was Charles Ashford's cousin. Because William Garrett had helped arrange the sale of Ruth to the Deep South. And because William Garrett's plantation was the hub of a network that connected a dozen of the largest slave holding families in Virginia. Hagar was not just moving randomly from plantation to plantation. She was climbing a ladder, moving closer and closer to the center of power, gathering information and building connections at every step. And when she reached the top, she was going to push the whole thing down. But first, she had to survive William Garrett. William Garrett was the worst kind of master. He was intelligent and cruel, patient and vicious, a man who took pleasure in breaking the spirits of his slaves. He did not use the whip for punishment. He used it for entertainment. He did not sell troublesome slaves. He tortured them until they died or went mad. And he had heard the stories about Hagar. When Marcus Webb delivered her to Garrett's plantation, William was waiting at the gate. He was a tall, thin man with pale blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. He looked at Hagar the way a scientist looks at a specimen, calculating and cold. "So this is the famous Hagar," he said, "the slave who destroys everything she touches, the slave who speaks in tongues and reads forbidden books, the slave who knows things she shouldn't know." He walked around her slowly, examining her like livestock at auction. "You don't look special to me," he continued. "You look like every other field hand I've ever owned. Big, strong, useful for heavy labor. But there's something in your eyes, isn't there? Something that the others don't have." He stopped in front of her and leaned close. "I'm going to enjoy finding out what it is," he whispered. "And I'm going to enjoy destroying it." Hagar said nothing. She kept her eyes lowered, her face blank, her body still. She had learned long ago that the best defense against men like William Garrett was to give them nothing to react to. No fear, no anger, no defiance, just emptiness. William Garrett frowned. He had expected more. He had expected terror or resistance or something he could use against her. Instead, he got nothing. "Take her to the quarters," he said to the overseer. "Put her to work in the fields and watch her every moment of every day. I want to know everything she does." Hagar was led away, but not before she caught one last glimpse of William Garrett's face. And in that moment, She saw something that made her blood run cold. He was not just cruel. He was intelligent. He suspected that there was more to her than met the eye, and he was determined to find out what it was. He was going to watch her, study her, test her, looking for any sign of weakness or deception. This was going to be the most dangerous game she had ever played. And the stakes were her life. The next 3 years were the hardest of Hagar's existence. William Garrett watched her constantly, looking for any sign of the abilities he had heard about. He tested her in 100 different ways, asking her questions that only a literate person could answer, leaving books where she might find them, setting traps that would reveal her true nature. Hagar evaded them all. She had years of practice at hiding her intelligence, and she used every technique she had ever learned. She played dumb. She pretended to be confused by simple questions. She handled books like they were strange, alien objects that meant nothing to her. She even occasionally made mistakes in her work that a smart person would never make, reinforcing the impression that she was just another strong, stupid field hand. But it was exhausting. The constant vigilance, the endless deception, the knowledge that a single slip could mean torture and death. There were nights when Hagar lay in her tiny cabin and wondered if it was worth it. Nights when she thought about giving up, about letting William Garrett win, about accepting that she would die on this plantation like so many others before her. But then she would think about her mother, about Ruth, who had risked everything to give her daughter the gift of knowledge, about the wagon disappearing down the dusty road, about the promise she had made to herself on that terrible morning. And she would get up the next day and keep fighting. During those 3 years, Hagar accomplished something remarkable. Despite William Garrett's constant surveillance, she managed to build the beginnings of a network. She identified other slaves who could be trusted, who were willing to take risks, who shared her hunger for freedom and justice. She taught them signals and codes, ways of communicating that looked like normal behavior to anyone who didn't know what to look for. She began mapping the connections between plantations, the routes that slaves traveled, the people who could be bribed or manipulated. And she learned things about William Garrett that he would have killed to keep secret. She learned that he was heavily in debt to a bank in Richmond. She learned that his wife was having an affair with the local minister. She learned that he had forged documents to claim land that rightfully belonged to his neighbor. She learned that he had killed a slave 3 years earlier and covered it up, telling the authorities that the man had run away. Each piece of information was filed away in that perfect memory of hers, waiting for the right moment to be used. That moment came in the fall of 1841. William Garrett had finally found what he thought was proof of Hagar's literacy. A slave from a neighboring plantation had been caught with a book, and under torture, he had confessed that Hagar had taught him to read. It was a lie. Hagar had never seen the man before. But William Garrett didn't care about the truth. He cared about finally breaking the slave who had defied him for 3 years. He called her to the main house and confronted her with the accusation. He described her the confession. He described the punishment she would receive, and then he sat back, waiting for her to beg, to confess, to break. Instead, Hagar did something that William Garrett never expected. She smiled. "You're going to sell me," she said. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. "You're going to take me to the auction in Richmond tomorrow morning, and you're going to sell me to the highest bidder, and you're going to do it quietly, without telling anyone why." William Garrett stared at her in disbelief. "Why would I do that?" "Because I know about the bank," Hagar said. I know how much you owe and when the payments are due. I know that if you don't come up with $3,000 in the next 30 days, you'll lose everything." She paused, watching the color drain from his face. "I also know about the land you stole from Thomas Mercer. I know about the slave you killed. And I know about your wife and Reverend Whitmore." William Garrett's hands were shaking now. "How? How do you?" "It doesn't matter how," Hagar said. "What matters is that I know. And if you don't sell me tomorrow, quietly and without questions, I'll make sure everyone else knows too. Your creditors, your neighbors, the sheriff, your wife." She leaned forward, and for the first time, she let him see what was really in her eyes. "You're not going to break me, Mr. Garrett. I'm going to break you, but I'm going to do it slowly, over many years, after I've moved on to my next destination. You'll never know when the blow is coming or where it will come from. You'll just wake up one day and find that everything you've built has crumbled to dust." She smiled again. "Unless you let me go right now, tonight, then maybe, just maybe, I'll forget what I know about you. Maybe I'll let you keep your pathetic little kingdom for a few more years. Maybe." William Garrett looked at her for a long moment. His face was pale, his hands still trembling. He had broken hundreds of slaves in his lifetime. He had never once been broken by one. Until now. "Get out," he whispered. "Get out of my house." The next morning, Hagar was on her way to the Richmond slave market, and William Garrett never spoke of her again to anyone for as long as he lived. Hagar Ashford, the giant who broke the chains. Part 2. The Richmond slave market in the fall of 1841 was one of the largest human trafficking operations in the Western Hemisphere. Located in a complex of buildings near the waterfront, it processed thousands of enslaved people every year, sending them south to the cotton fields of Alabama and Mississippi, east to the rice plantations of South Carolina, and west to the sugar farms of Louisiana. It was a machine designed to destroy families and extract profit from human suffering, and it operated with the cold efficiency of any other business enterprise. Hagar had been through slave markets before, but never one this large. The holding pens stretched for hundreds of feet, crowded with men, women, and children waiting to be sold. The air hung thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the sound of weeping. Families pressed close together, knowing that within hours they might be torn apart forever. Mothers clutched their babies with a desperate strength, hoping against hope some buyer would take them as a group. Hagar watched it all with those calculating eyes. She took in the layout of the buildings, the guards' schedules, the faces of traders and buyers. She listened to conversations, picking up details on prices, destinations, and the most powerful slave owners in the region. And she began connecting dots. In the holding pen next to her stood a man named Solomon. He was around 50, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. For 30 years, he had been a blacksmith on a North Carolina plantation, skilled enough that his master hired him out to neighboring farms. But his master had died. The estate was being sold off, and Solomon was now headed to market like any other piece of property. Solomon could read, not fluently, just basic words and numbers, but enough to be useful. More importantly, Solomon knew people. Over 3 decades, he had worked across different farms in North Carolina and Virginia, building relationships with hundreds of enslaved people. He knew who could be trusted, who was willing to take risks, who had skills that might serve an organized resistance. Hagar recognized his value at once. She approached him carefully, using the signals and codes she had honed over the years. A certain way of positioning her hands, a pattern of words that sounded ordinary, but carried hidden meanings. a series of innocent, seeming questions that revealed whether the listener was a potential ally or a threat. Solomon understood. He had seen similar codes before, in the whispered resistance networks that existed on every plantation. He responded with his own signals, establishing trust, confirming he was ready to join whatever Hagar was planning. They talked for hours that night, voices low, faces close in the darkness of the holding pen. Hagar told him part of her plan, not all, but enough for him to grasp the scale of what she was attempting. She was building a network across the entire state of Virginia. She was mapping connections between plantations, identifying vulnerabilities in the system, preparing for a strike that would shake slavery to its foundations. Solomon listened in silence, his eyes widening with each word. When Hagar finished, he sat for a long moment, staring at nothing. "You're either the smartest person I've ever met," he said finally, "or the craziest. Maybe both. Does it matter?" Hagar asked. Solomon shook his head slowly. "No, I don't suppose it does. What do you need from me?" "Contacts," Hagar said. "Names of trustworthy people in North Carolina. Routes between plantations. Information on traders who move slaves between states. Anything you know that might help." For the next 3 hours, Solomon talked. He gave Hagar dozens of names, along with descriptions of each person, their skills, and their locations. He described the routes slave coffles traveled between North Carolina and Virginia, the stops they made, the opportunities for communication along the way. He told her about underground networks that already existed, secret churches and midnight meetings where enslaved people gathered to pray, plan, and dream of freedom. Hagar filed it all away in that perfect memory, every name, every route, every piece of information. By sunrise, she had added hundreds of new data points to the mental map she was building. That morning, Solomon was sold to a cotton planter from Alabama. Hagar never saw him again, but the information he gave her proved invaluable in the years to come, allowing her to extend her network far beyond Virginia into neighboring states. Hagar herself was bought by a man named Robert Cunningham, who owned a small tobacco farm in Hanover County. He was not cruel, just ordinary, unremarkable in every way. He worked his slaves hard but did not abuse them. He provided adequate food and shelter. He rarely used the whip. He was exactly the kind of master Hagar needed at this stage. Someone who would not watch her too closely. Someone who would give her the freedom to keep building her network. She spent 2 years on the Cunningham farm, and during that time, she made more progress than in all the years before. The farm sat at a crossroads where several major roads intersected. Travelers constantly passed through slave traders moving coffles between markets, peddlers selling goods from town to town, free black people traveling on legitimate business. Each traveler was a potential source of information, a potential link in Hagar's chain. She developed a system for making contact. She would find reasons to be near the road when travelers passed. She would offer water or food in exchange for conversation. She would ask innocent, sounding questions about conditions elsewhere, about people she claimed to know, about news from the wider world. And she would file away everything she learned, adding it to the ever-growing map in her mind. By the end of her second year on the Cunningham farm, Hagar had established connections with enslaved people on over 40 plantations across Virginia and North Carolina. She had identified 17 individuals willing to take significant risks for the cause of freedom. She had mapped the routes between every major slave market in the region, and she had begun developing something far more ambitious than a simple escape network. She was building an intelligence operation. Every piece of information flowing through her network was analyzed and cataloged as reports on which masters were in financial trouble, Details about which plantations had weak security, information about which slave traders were corrupt enough to bribe, data on patrol schedules and safe house locations. And she was teaching others to do the same. Using the codes and signals she had created, she trained her contacts to gather and transmit information. She established a system of dead drops and secret messages, allowing information to travel hundreds of miles without any direct contact between the people involved. It was a remarkable achievement, all the more so because it was accomplished by enslaved people who were forbidden to read, forbidden to travel, forbidden to gather in groups, forbidden to do anything that might threaten their master's power. But Hagar knew it was not enough. Information was power, but only if it could be used. To use what she was gathering, she needed something more: access to the centers of power. She needed to be close to the decision makers, to those who held the keys to the system. She needed to be sold again. In the spring of 1843, Hagar engineered her fifth sale. She had learned from her experience with William Garrett that the best way to control her own destiny was to create situations that forced her masters to sell her. And she had become very good at that. On the Cunningham farm, she used a subtler approach. She began displaying knowledge an enslaved person should not have, correcting the overseer's arithmetic when he calculated crop yields, predicting changes in the weather with uncanny accuracy, mentioning details about distant events she could not possibly have known through normal means. The Cunningham family became convinced she was a witch. This belief was not uncommon in rural Virginia. Many white people, despite their supposed Christianity, harbored deep superstitions about the supernatural powers of enslaved Africans. They believed in root doctors and conjure women, in curses and hexes and evil eyes, and they were terrified of having such a person in their household. Robert Cunningham sold Hagar at the first opportunity, relieved to be rid of her before she could bring some terrible curse upon his family. He sold her to a trader named James Monroe, no relation to the former president, who specialized in purchasing troublesome slaves and reselling them to buyers who did not know their histories. James Monroe was exactly the kind of man Hagar needed. He was connected to every major slave market in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. He knew every plantation owner, every buyer, every seller. He possessed information about the slave trade that few others had, and he could be manipulated. Hagar spent 6 months with James Monroe, traveling with his coffles of enslaved people from market to market. It was a brutal existence. The coffles walked for miles every day, chained together, fed just enough to keep them moving. Many died along the way from exhaustion, disease, or despair. But for Hagar, it was an opportunity. She used those 6 months to map the entire slave trade network of the Upper South. She learned every major buyer and seller's name, their locations, preferences, and financial situations. She learned the routes between markets, the auction schedules, the prices different types of slaves commanded. She found the weak points, where the system could be disrupted, where pressure could be applied. And she made more connections. Every coffle contained enslaved people from different plantations, different states, different backgrounds. Each one was a potential link in her network, a potential carrier of information, a potential ally in the war she was waging. By the time James Monroe sold her, Hagar had contacts on over 100 plantations across 4 states. She had trained over 50 people in her system of codes and signals. She had created an intelligence network spanning thousands of square miles. And she was just getting started. Her 6th sale took her to a plantation in Louisa County, owned by a man named Frederick Holmes. Holmes was a lawyer as well as a plantation owner, and his study held something Hagar had been searching for years to find: a complete collection of court records and legal documents relating to slavery in Virginia. This was the treasure she had been seeking. The legal codes she had studied years ago gave her a framework for understanding the system. But court records were different. Court records showed how the law actually worked in practice, how it was interpreted, applied, and sometimes bent or broken. Court records contained the details no law book could provide. For 2 years, Hagar studied those records with the same intensity. She had once applied to Blackstone and Cicero. She learned about every slavery-related case decided in Virginia courts. She learned about precedents, exceptions, technicalities, and loopholes. She learned about cases where slaves had been freed on technical grounds, where wills had been contested, where property transfers had been challenged. And she found something extraordinary. Hidden in the records of a case from 1812, she discovered a precedent apparently forgotten by everyone in the legal profession. The case involved a slave named James, who had been promised freedom in his master's will, then sold to another owner before the master died. The new owner claimed the sale nullified the promise of freedom, but the court disagreed. The court ruled that a promise of freedom, once made and witnessed, could not be revoked by a subsequent sale. The promise followed the person, not the property. The implications were staggering. If a slave owner could be induced to promise freedom to an enslaved person, and if that promise could be witnessed and documented, then that promise was legally binding, even if the slave was later sold. Hagar immediately saw how this could be used. If she could get slave owners to make promises of freedom, even informal ones, and document those promises, she could potentially free enslaved people using the master's own words against them. But she needed more. A single obscure precedent from 30 years ago would not be enough. She needed to find more cases, more exceptions, more technicalities. She needed to build a legal arsenal that could attack slavery from within. She spent another 6 months on the Holmes plantation, studying every document she could lay hands on. Then, when she had learned all she could, she arranged to be sold again. Her 7th, 8th, and 9th sales followed a similar pattern. Each time, she targeted a specific plantation for a specific reason. A plantation with connections to the political establishment, a plantation near a major transportation hub, a plantation owned by a family with influence in the state legislature. At each stop, she gathered more information, made more connections, and trained more people in her network. And at each stop, she moved closer to the center of power. By 1850, Hagar had been sold 9 times. She was 30 years old, though she looked older. Years of hard labor and constant stress had taken their toll on her body. But her mind was sharper than ever, and her network had grown to include contacts on over 200 plantations across 5 states. She was ready for the next phase of her plan. Her 10th sale took her to Henrico County, to a plantation called Oak Hill. The owner was a man named Thomas Ashford. The name was no coincidence. Thomas Ashford was the son of Charles Ashford, the man who had destroyed Hagar's family 20 years earlier, the man who had beaten her mother and sold her to the Deep South, the man who had set Hagar on this path of vengeance. Thomas had inherited Sweetwater Plantation after his father's death in 1845. But Sweetwater was not enough for him. He had ambitions his father never possessed. He wanted to build an empire. Over the previous 5 years, Thomas Ashford had acquired 6 additional plantations, including Oak Hill. He had consolidated his holdings into one of the largest slave-owning operations in Virginia, with over 800 enslaved people working his fields. He had established connections with banks, politicians, and traders throughout the South. He had become one of the most powerful men in the state, and he had no idea that the woman just sold to his plantation was the same girl who had stood in his father's library 20 years ago. Reading Cicero in the original Latin, Hagar was different now. 2 decades of hard labor had changed her body. The constant stress of survival had changed her face. She was still tall, still imposing, but the girl who had watched her mother being taken away was long gone. In her place stood a woman hardened by decades of struggle. A woman who had seen things that would break most people. A woman who had transformed herself into something Thomas Ashford could not recognize. But Hagar recognized him. She saw his father's eyes in his face. She heard his father's voice in his words. And when she looked at him, she saw the man who had destroyed her family, resurrected in new flesh, continuing the same evil his father had perpetrated. The circle was almost complete. Hagar spent the next 2 years on Oak Hill, working as a field hand and watching Thomas Ashford carefully. She learned his routines, his habits, his weaknesses. She learned about his business dealings and his financial situation. She learned about his other plantations and the people who managed them, and she began to understand the scope of what she was dealing with. Thomas Ashford's empire was vast, but it was also vulnerable. He had expanded too quickly, borrowing too much to acquire his new plantations. He was dependent on a volatile tobacco market. He was stretched thin, trying to manage 6 separate properties with limited resources. More importantly, his record-keeping was a mess. The rapid expansion had created chaos. In his documentation, property records were incomplete, sales records contradictory, ownership documents scattered across half a dozen different locations. Hagar saw the opportunity immediately. In a system that depended on documentation, incomplete and contradictory records were a fatal weakness. If documents could be lost or altered, if ownership could be challenged, if the paper trail connecting master to slave could be disrupted, then the entire system could be thrown into chaos. And Hagar knew exactly how to create that chaos. For the next 2 years, she worked patiently to put the pieces in place. She identified where Thomas Ashford kept his records. She studied the formats and styles of his documents. She learned to forge his signature so perfectly that even he could not tell the difference. And she began making copies of key documents, altering them in subtle ways that would not be noticed immediately, but would create legal problems later. She also continued building her network. Oak Hill was the hub of Thomas Ashford's empire, and enslaved people from all 6 of his plantations passed through regularly. Hagar used these opportunities to expand her contacts, share information, and coordinate the next phase of her plan. By 1852, everything was in place. Hagar had contacts on every one of Thomas Ashford's plantations. She had forged documents, challenging the ownership of hundreds of enslaved people. She had allies positioned in key locations throughout the county. And she had developed a plan that would bring Thomas Ashford's empire crashing down. But then something happened that almost destroyed everything. In the summer of 1852, Thomas Ashford decided to sell Oak Hill. He had overextended himself financially and needed to liquidate some holdings to pay his debts. Oak Hill was his most valuable property. Selling it would solve his immediate financial problems. But selling Oak Hill meant selling all the enslaved people who lived there, including Hagar. This was a disaster. Hagar had spent 2 years positioning herself at the center of Thomas Ashford's empire. All her plans depended on her being able to access his records, communicate with his other plantations, and execute her strategy from within his organization. If she was sold to a stranger, everything she had built would be thrown into chaos. She had to stop the sale. But how? She could not simply blackmail Thomas Ashford the way she had blackmailed William Garrett. Thomas was too powerful, too well connected. If she threatened him, he would simply have her killed or sold to a trader heading for the deep south. She needed a different approach. The answer came from an unexpected source: Thomas Ashford's wife, Elizabeth Ashford. Elizabeth was a woman of contradictions. Raised in a wealthy Charleston family, surrounded by enslaved servants her entire life, she had accepted slavery as a natural part of the world, without ever questioning it. But she was also deeply religious, a devout Presbyterian who took her faith seriously, and she was troubled. The rapid expansion of her husband's slave holdings had disturbed her. She had watched families torn apart to staff new plantations. She had seen the brutality required to control so many people. She had begun to wonder if the institution she had accepted all her life was truly compatible with the Christianity she professed. Hagar sensed this uncertainty and decided to exploit it. She began finding ways to interact with Elizabeth Ashford, offering to help with tasks around the main house, making herself useful in small ways. She was careful never to seem too intelligent or capable. She presented herself as a simple, pious woman, someone who had found comfort in faith despite the hardships of her life. And she began planting seeds. She would mention casually that she prayed for her masters every night. She would quote Bible verses about mercy and compassion. She would tell stories about other enslaved people she had known, stories that emphasized their humanity, their faith, their hopes and dreams. Slowly, over many months, Elizabeth Ashford began to see enslaved people differently, not as property, but as people. Not as problems to be managed, but as souls to be saved. When Thomas Ashford announced his plan to sell Oak Hill, Elizabeth objected. She did not want the families on the plantation torn apart. She did not want to be responsible for sending people she had come to know to uncertain fates in distant places. Thomas was surprised by his wife's resistance. Elizabeth had never questioned his business decisions before, but she was insistent. After several weeks of argument, they reached a compromise. Oak Hill would be sold, but the enslaved people would be distributed among Thomas Ashford's other plantations, rather than sold on the open market. It was not a perfect solution. Hagar would still be moved from Oak Hill, but she would remain within Thomas Ashford's empire, able to continue her work. She was transferred to Sweetwater. The irony was not lost on her. 20 years after being sold away from the plantation where she was born, Hagar was returning. But she was not the same person who had left. She was a general now, commanding an army of allies and information, preparing for the final battle of a war that had lasted most of her life. Sweetwater had changed in the 2 decades since Hagar left. Charles Ashford was dead, and his son had transformed the plantation into the headquarters of a larger operation. New buildings had been constructed. The fields had been expanded. The slave quarters had been enlarged. But some things were the same. The library, where Hagar had taught herself to read, was still there, though the books had been moved. The whipping post where her mother had been beaten still stood in the center of the slave quarters, a reminder of the violence that kept the system running. And the road down which Ruth had disappeared was still visible from the quarters, a dusty line stretching toward a horizon Hagar had never stopped watching. She found the tree where she had stood on that terrible morning, watching the wagon carry her mother away. She touched the bark, feeling the years compressed into that rough surface, and she made a new vow, a promise to the ghost of the girl she had once been. "I'm back," she whispered, "and I'm going to finish what I started." Her 11th sale came in 1854, when Thomas Ashford decided to move some of his workers to a newly acquired plantation in Chesterfield County. Hagar was among those transferred, along with over 100 other enslaved people. But by this point, it did not matter where she was located. Her network spanned all of Thomas Ashford's plantations. Her forged documents were in place. Her allies were positioned. Everything was ready for the final phase of her plan. She spent the next 2 years refining her preparations, making sure every piece was in place. She verified that her forged documents would hold up under scrutiny. She confirmed that her allies knew their roles. She studied the legal procedures required to challenge ownership claims. And she waited for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came in the winter of 1856, when Thomas Ashford did something that played directly into her hands. He decided to consolidate all his ownership records in one location. Thomas Ashford had finally realized that his scattered and contradictory documentation was creating problems. He was having trouble proving ownership of some of his enslaved people, which was causing issues with insurance and estate planning. So he ordered all records from all 6 plantations to be gathered at Sweetwater, where they would be organized and verified. It was exactly the opportunity Hagar had been waiting for. The consolidation took several months. Documents were transported from all over Virginia, collected at Sweetwater, and stored in a newly constructed records room adjacent to the main house. Thomas Ashford hired a team of clerks to sort through the papers and create a master registry of all his enslaved holdings. Hagar was assigned to assist the clerks. It was a strange assignment for a field hand, but Hagar had cultivated a reputation as a reliable worker who could be trusted with important tasks. The clerks needed someone to carry boxes, retrieve documents, and perform other physical labor. Hagar was strong enough for the work, and she seemed too simple-minded to cause any problems. They had no idea what they were inviting into their midst. For 3 months, Hagar worked alongside the clerks, carrying boxes of documents back and forth, watching as they organized the records, listening as they discussed the legal technicalities of ownership. And every night after the clerks had gone home, she worked alone. She replaced documents with forged versions she had prepared years earlier. She altered dates and signatures. She created contradictions that would call ownership into question. She inserted documents that had never existed. Papers that promised freedom to enslaved people. Papers that challenged the legitimacy of sales. Papers that would throw the entire registry into chaos. And she did something else. Something that would prove to be the most devastating blow of all. She created a set of documents that, if accepted as genuine, would legally transfer ownership of 847 enslaved people to themselves. It was an audacious forgery. The documents purported to be a series of manumission agreements, signed by Thomas Ashford over a period of years, promising freedom to his enslaved workers in exchange for loyal service. Each document was witnessed by people now dead, making verification impossible. Each document was dated in the past, during periods when Thomas Ashford's record keeping was known to be chaotic. And each document was written in a style that perfectly matched other legitimate documents in the archive. Hagar had spent years preparing these forgeries. She had studied Thomas Ashford's handwriting until she could reproduce it perfectly. She had analyzed the paper and ink used in his legitimate documents and obtained matching materials. She had researched seminary in the witnesses whose signatures she was forging, learning their writing styles and the circumstances of their deaths. It was a masterpiece of deception, and if it worked, it would be the largest mass emancipation in Virginia history. But Hagar knew that forgeries alone would not be enough. Documents could be challenged. Experts could be called in. Courts could rule against her. She needed something more. She needed chaos. In November of 1856, Thomas Ashford's second-largest plantation caught fire. The blaze started in the tobacco drying barn, and spread to the main house before it could be contained. The plantation's records, which had not yet been transferred to Sweetwater, were destroyed. 1 month later, a series of suspicious accidents plagued his plantation in Louisa County. Tools were sabotaged, crops were damaged, livestock escaped through mysteriously opened gates. The overseer quit in frustration, and Thomas Ashford was forced to spend weeks personally managing the property. In January of 1857, Thomas Ashford's bank called in a loan that was not supposed to be due for another 2 years. The bank claimed the loan documents showed an earlier due date. Thomas Ashford insisted this was wrong, but when he searched for his copy of the original agreement, he could not find it. These were not coincidences. Each event was orchestrated by Hagar's network. Executed by allies she had positioned over years of careful planning. The goal was to distract Thomas Ashford, to keep him off balance, to prevent him from paying close attention to what was happening in his records room, and it worked. By the spring of 1857, Thomas Ashford was overwhelmed. His empire was in disarray. His finances were strained. His health was failing. He had neither the time nor the energy to personally verify the consolidated records that his clerks were preparing. On May 15, 1857, the clerks presented Thomas Ashford with the completed master registry of his enslaved holdings. Thomas signed it without reading it carefully. He was too tired, too distracted, too confident in the competence of his employees. He had just signed his own destruction. 3 days later, a man named James Henderson walked into the Henrico County Courthouse and filed a legal challenge on behalf of 847 enslaved people. The challenge claimed that these individuals had been promised freedom by their owner, Thomas Ashford, and that the promises were documented in the recently consolidated records. The challenge demanded that the court recognize these manumission agreements and grant freedom to all 847 people. James Henderson was a free black man who worked as a clerk in a Richmond law office. He was also one of Hagar's oldest and most trusted allies. She had met him years earlier during her time with the slave trader James Monroe, and had been cultivating him ever since. He was one of the few free black people in Virginia who understood the legal system well enough to navigate it, and he was willing to take enormous risks for the cause of freedom. The legal challenge created immediate chaos. Thomas Ashford was summoned to court to respond. He insisted that the manumission agreements were forgeries, that he had never signed any such documents, that the whole thing was a fraud. But when the court examined the documents, they found something disturbing. The agreements were in the same handwriting as other documents known to be genuine. They were on the same paper, with the same ink, bearing the same signatures and seals. They were indistinguishable from authentic documents, and they were part of the official consolidated registry that Thomas Ashford himself had signed and submitted to the court. Thomas Ashford was trapped. If he claimed the manumission agreements were forged, he was also claiming that his own consolidated registry was fraudulent. But he had signed that registry, certifying its accuracy. If the registry was fraudulent, then Thomas Ashford himself was guilty of perjury and fraud. The court ordered an investigation. Experts were brought in to examine the documents. Witnesses were called to testify about the circumstances under which the agreements had supposedly been signed. The proceedings dragged on for months, while Thomas Ashford's financial situation deteriorated further, and Hagar watched it all from a distance, waiting. In August of 1857, the court issued its preliminary ruling. The manumission agreements appeared to be genuine. The enslaved people named in the agreements were entitled to their freedom. Pending a final determination, 847 people walked out of Thomas Ashford's plantations that day. They walked past the overseers who had whipped them. They walked past the gates that had confined them. They walked past the big houses where their masters had lived in luxury while they labored in the fields. They walked into freedom. Thomas Ashford fought the ruling for another 3 years. He spent every dollar he had on lawyers and investigators. He called in every political favor he was owed. He insisted to anyone who would listen that he was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy. And he was right. He just could not prove it. In 1860, the final court ruling came down. The manumission agreements were upheld. The 847 people were legally free. Thomas Ashford was ordered to provide them with the documentation necessary to prove their status. The stress of the legal battle, combined with his financial ruin, destroyed Thomas Ashford's health. He died in October of 1860, just months before the Civil War began. His empire was sold off to pay his debts. The Ashford family, once one of the wealthiest in Virginia, was reduced to poverty within a generation. And Hagar Ashford disappeared. Her 12th and final sale had never actually happened. She had been among the 847 people freed by the court ruling. She had walked out of Sweetwater Plantation on that August day in 1857, 40 years after she had first arrived there as an infant. But she did not stay in Virginia. She knew there were people who suspected her involvement in what had happened. People who would try to find her. People who might seek revenge. So she vanished, using the network she had built to escape north, beyond the reach of slave catchers and angry former masters. Some say she made it to Canada. Others say she settled in a free black community in Ohio or Pennsylvania. A few claim she returned to Virginia during the Civil War, helping the Union Army identify Confederate supply routes and communication networks. The truth is that no one knows what happened to Hagar Ashford after she walked off that plantation. She left no letters, no diaries, no records of any kind. The woman who had spent her life creating and manipulating documents made sure there would be no documents about herself. But her legacy lived on. The 847 people she freed became the nucleus of a thriving free black community in Virginia and beyond. They built churches and schools. They started businesses and farms. They raised families and told stories about the woman who had set them free. And they continued her work. The network Hagar had built did not disappear when she did. It evolved and expanded, becoming part of the larger movement that would eventually be known as the Underground Railroad. The codes and signals she had developed were taught to new generations. The connections she had established continued to function, helping enslaved people escape to freedom throughout the years leading up to the Civil War. By the time the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, abolishing slavery throughout the United States, Hagar Ashford's network had helped an estimated 2,000 people escape to freedom. Her legacy extended far beyond the 847 people she had directly freed. But perhaps the most important part of her legacy was something less tangible. Hagar Ashford proved that the system could be beaten. Not by force, not by violence, but by intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking. She showed that an enslaved person, denied every opportunity for education and advancement, could teach herself to read and write and think more clearly than any of her masters. She demonstrated that the legal system designed to perpetuate slavery could be turned against itself. She revealed that the chains of bondage were made not of iron but of paper, and that paper could be used to destroy them. She was sold 12 times because they feared her mind. They never imagined that with every sale, she was building the weapon that would defeat them. The last known words attributed to Hagar Ashford come from a letter supposedly written to a member of her network shortly after her escape from Virginia. The letter has never been authenticated, and its current location is unknown, but the words it contains have been passed down through generations. A message from a woman who spent her life fighting for freedom. They tried to make me an animal. The letter reads, "They denied me the words that make us human. They sold me like livestock, beat me like a beast, worked me like a machine. But they forgot something important. They forgot that the mind cannot be chained. They forgot that knowledge, once acquired, can never be taken away. They forgot that every blow, every sale, every cruelty only sharpened my purpose and strengthened my resolve. I was sold 12 times. 12 times they tried to break me. 12 times they failed. And in the end, I broke them. The chains are made of paper. Remember that. The power they hold over us is written in books and recorded in registers and filed in courthouses. It seems solid. It seems permanent. It seems unbreakable. But paper burns. Paper tears. Paper can be forged and altered and lost. The chains that bind us are more fragile than they appear. If only we have the wisdom to see their weaknesses and the courage to exploit them. I was just one woman. I had no army, no weapons, no power. All I had was my mind, my patience, and my unwavering determination to be free. And with those tools, I brought down an empire. If I can do it, so can you. So can anyone who refuses to accept that their humanity is less than another's. So can anyone who understands that freedom is not a gift that is given, but a right that is taken. They sold me 12 times, and I destroyed them 12 times over. Remember me? Remember what I did. And never, ever stop fighting. The letter is signed simply Hagar. Today, in a small cemetery in Henrico County, Virginia, there is a weathered stone marker. It stands among the graves of enslaved people who lived and died on the Ashford plantations. People whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told, whose lives were considered property rather than history. The marker bears no name. It was placed there in 1892 by a group of elderly men and women who had been among the 847 freed by Hagar's plan. They could not find her grave, did not know where or when she had died, but they wanted something to mark her existence. The inscription on the marker is short, just 5 words carved into the stone. She remembered, she returned, she freed. Below those words is a symbol that few people today would recognize. It is one of the codes that Hagar developed, a mark that her network used to identify safe places and trusted people. It means, roughly translated, the way is open. Pass in safety. Visitors to the cemetery sometimes leave flowers at the marker. They do not know who is commemorated there. They do not know the story of the woman who was sold 12 times and destroyed her masters 12 times over. They do not know about the network she built, the documents she forged, the 8047 lives she saved. But something about that marker speaks to them. Something about those 5 words resonates in a way they cannot explain. She remembered. She returned. She freed. In a world that tried to erase her, Hagar Ashford wrote herself into history, and she did it with the very tools they thought they could deny her. She did it with words.